On the way home, would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome, friends of the On the Way Home podcast. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, my team at Blue Door, which is just north of Toronto in York Region, also operating a little bit in Durham and Peel, do life-saving work helping our most vulnerable across the region find affordable housing, get healthy, and find meaningful and well-paying employment. And we do that in partnership with our friends at the Canadian Alliance on Homelessness. Now, right now, the Canadian Alliance is pushing a campaign for a housing benefit. I urge you to check that out. Go to cah.ca. They make it really easy. You put in a little bit of information, and from that, right away, they fire off a beautiful letter to your MPs asking them to consider this new housing benefit. You could read all about it on their website to get more information, but it's a great way to be part of the solution. Beyond that, if you're looking for some technical training or you want to become a Built for Zero community, check out the website as well. And all you need will be right there at your fingertips. Let's get to today's guest. If you ask me right now, what are two of the biggest things, not just across Canada, probably in the world, that would help to prevent and end homelessness? It is, of course, a whole bunch of affordable housing, accessible housing, deeply affordable housing. That takes time, and we may not do that quickly. But what could make a bigger difference if it was done really, really quick would be some type of income support. Right now, what we see at Blue Door, our clients that are receiving social assistance might get $720 a month. If they're receiving disability assistance, about $1,200 a month. But the average one-bedroom apartment in York Region is about $2,000. Similar across the GTA, a little down, a little up across Canada, maybe in the west of Vancouver, even a little higher than that. The gap is huge, and something needs to be done about that. During the pandemic, we had CERB, and we said the benchmark was about $2,000 a month to help people get by, and that was the amount. So why are we looking at social assistance rates that are below, I believe, what they were in 1995 when they were cut, and they never came back all that strong? So we need to take a look at that. So we have two amazing people, experts in their fields, on the show today. We have Mohy Tabbara, who's a policy advisor at Maytree and one of the authors of this Welfare in Canada report we're going to speak to. And we have Jennfer, who is a consultant at Maytree and also the other co-lead on this paper. Jennfer and Mohy, welcome to the show.
Hi,
Thank
Michael.
you for having us.
Great to have you both here. So we ask everyone the same question. It's a little different for everyone because it's a very personal question, if you don't mind. And that is, what does home mean to you? We'll start with Mohy and then we'll go to Jennfer.
Thank you for the question. When I think of home, I think of safety and comfort. A place of security where you can be yourself without any scrutiny. And at Maytree, we focus a lot on the right to housing. That's one of our two main areas with income security. But as many have experienced, and as I have experienced myself, not all housing is a home. Although housing in itself can, is a privilege. But hopefully we can create the security and this comfort for more people in Canada.
Well said, Jennfer.
I got to tell you, Michael, I love that we're starting with this question because it's really great in the context of what we're talking about today. Well, first, I just wanted to acknowledge that I make my home on the unceded traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation here in BC on the West Coast. And to me, home means, somewhere secure and safe, somewhere warm, somewhere where it's the sort of physical foundation of living my life. And the report that we're talking about today, what it reveals really is that people who receive social assistance in Canada are pretty much universally struggling to have that kind of foundation and that kind of home. And that's because, as you were mentioning, because of the very low incomes that they get from what is supposed to be a key part of Canada's social safety net.
Absolutely, and well put. And we can't wait to dive into that report. Before we do, Jennfer, we're going to start with you. Can you just share a little bit about your journey into the work that you do now?
Sure. In terms of the Welfare in Canada report that we're talking about today, I've been researching and writing this report since 2020, after I moved back to BC from Toronto. And what I was doing there, it's kind of a logical extension from the work I was doing there. Which was I was a policy analyst and an advocate on social assistance and other income security programs at a legal clinic for about 12 years. And in that work, I worked really closely with people receiving social assistance, legal experts, policy analysts, and advocates from other organizations, and government officials and politicians. And the work that we were doing was trying to improve the income security programs that low-income people, particularly in Ontario, but also across Canada, rely on. And, my takeaway from that work was, besides just how deeply inadequate social assistance incomes are, is that addressing the problem of social assistance, of poverty and social assistance, basically, is really a critical part of the efforts to reduce poverty and end poverty, and by extension, addressing the homelessness crisis that we have in Canada.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Mohy, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thank you. So I lead Maytree's work on income security. I most notably am one of the co-authors of Welfare in Canada with Jennfer, and the author of Maytree's other flagship report, Social Assistance Summaries, which is a companion report that looks at the number of cases and beneficiaries of social assistance across Canada. So to tell you a bit more about Maytree itself, it's a charitable organization dedicated to advancing systemic solutions to poverty. And we undertake our work from a human rights-based approach, which means that we believe that everyone in Canada should have their economic and social rights safeguarded and protected. In terms of the policy work that we do, it's two main areas, the income security work that I lead, and then housing, which are very often two sides of the same coin. In terms of how I came to this work myself, I've had the opportunity to work in different social policy areas in my career, from housing and education and criminal justice, etc. And a lot of the issues are rooted in poverty, because we don't give people the right conditions to succeed and to live a life of dignity and to live their full potential. So it's definitely a privilege for me to do this work and to help illuminate the situation of social assistance recipients across Canada.
And I, for one, am so glad that you are doing this work, Mohy and Jennfer. Now, let's talk about the 2021 Welfare in Canada report. What was the report's purpose, and how did it come about?
So I'll take a shot at answering this. So the 2021 edition of Welfare in Canada is part of a series. It's an annual report that continues a publication that was started in the mid-1980s by the National Council of Welfare. And for those who have been doing this work for a long time, you'll recognize that name. It was a federal advisory body to the minister that basically took the pulse of poverty and low income in Canada. Unfortunately, the council was shut down. And after that, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy started up the Welfare in Canada series in order to keep the data available, in order to collect the data and keep the data available, because it's important information. And then Maytree took over the work a few years later. And the methodology in the report is the same as it was in the mid-80s. So we really can look at trends across about 35 years, which is really helpful. So the report presents the total incomes of 4 example households who qualify for social assistance benefits in each of Canada's provinces and territories in any given year, and, as I say, over time since 1985. And when we say welfare income, what we mean is the total income of households who qualify for social assistance, So it includes the social assistance benefits as well as provincial or territorial and federal benefits and refundable tax credits. So things like child benefits are included, the GST credit, sales tax credits, and other benefits depending on what's available in that jurisdiction. The 4 households are a single person with no dependents who is deemed able to work by the program rules, a single person with no dependents who qualifies as a person with a disability, a single parent with 1 child, and a couple with 2 children. And so what we do is we present the total amount of income that these households get from all those government sources, and we assume that they're not working, so there's no employment income that's counted in our calculations. And then we do an analysis that shows how their incomes have changed over time, and that's since the mid-1980s. We also do an analysis of the total incomes in terms of how they stack up against measures of adequacy. So how, do these incomes get people over the poverty line, the official poverty line in Canada? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But and we do that analysis of adequacy over time as well, so that we can say whether incomes have become more or less adequate relative to the poverty line over the last 20 years. And the report also talks about a few eligibility rules for social assistance in each province or territory. And we've got an appendix that talks about whether benefits are separate for basic needs and for shelter, or whether they're combined. And also an appendix that shows which benefits are indexed to inflation and which aren't. And we'll talk about indexing more, but what that means is whether benefits increase regularly according to increases in the cost of living. Some jurisdictions index their social assistance benefits, and so those benefits increase as costs rise, and that helps protect against loss of purchasing power. So there's a lot in the report.
Yeah, lots to break down. Mohy, anything to add to that?
No, Jennfer gave a good overview.
Okay, good. All right, well, let's dive into it because there's lots to chat about. Let's talk about some of the key learnings. I know there's a lot there, but what are some of the key ones that stuck out to you?
So as Jennfer mentioned, there are different elements in the report, and I would say maybe the 2 main findings usually every year is the modeling of how much can different types of households receive from different sources of income supports, including social assistance, and then the adequacy, which means how does it stack up relative to measures of poverty or low income. And so in terms of adequacy, in Canada, there are 3 measures. There's the low income measure, there's the LICO, and the market basket measure, which in the last few years has become Canada's official poverty measure. And in the report, we focus on the latter one, since it's become the metric that's used by governments themselves. And the market basket measure is a measure of poverty, but there's also a measure of deep poverty, which is 75% of the market basket measure. And what that means is that if someone lives below that 75%, that means that they can't meet their basic needs, such as housing and food, but also medicine. And it means that they definitely don't have any additional income that can be used for other purposes. The MBM is regional, so there's 50, I believe, over 50 regions across the country, but we use the one for the largest cities, since it's often the highest bar, although not always. And in the last report, which is the 2021 edition of the report that was published in 2022, unfortunately the adequacy of welfare incomes across the country is rather grim. And we can look at each household. The household that is often the worst off is the unattached singles considered employable, where in all 10 provinces they live in deep poverty, and not just deep poverty, but well below deep poverty. I believe the highest percentage, relative to the official poverty line is in Quebec, which was at 60%, which is well below the 75%. Unattached singles with disabilities are also living in deep poverty, except for 2 households. One is in Alberta for people receiving AISH, and Newfoundland and Labrador, where and those 2 households are in poverty, although not in deep poverty. I should note though that the market basket measure is not the best measure for people with disabilities because it often doesn't include um, elements that people with disabilities may need that other households may not. And of course, the experience of people with disabilities varies depending on the disability and the needs related to the disability. Households with children fare a bit better in the provinces. For the So we look at the single parent with 1 child, and 7 of the 10 are in deep poverty, which means that 3 live above the deep poverty line. And for the 2 children households, 2 of them live above deep poverty but still in poverty. So in total in the provinces, there are only 5 households out of 41 that are above the deep poverty line. Another development this year is the creation of the Northern Market Basket Measure, for Yukon and Northwest Territories, which allowed us for the first time to look at the adequacy of welfare incomes in the territories. And what it showed is one household, which is the unattached single with disability in the Northwest Territories, was living above the poverty line. So it's the only household in all of Canada that lives above the poverty line. And in general, the households in the territories fare a bit better. They are generally above the deep poverty line, but they do live in poverty. So usually every year when we complete the report, that's often the main finding that I look towards. And so as we can see, there's still a lot of work to do to make income supports sufficient for people.
And so a second learning that we can take from the report, besides the inadequacy, and it kind of stems from the issue of inadequacy, really. Given that as Mohy was just saying, like the vast majority of households that we look at in 2021 were living in poverty. All but 1 were living in poverty, and the vast majority were living in deep poverty. An interesting finding, given that case, is that most of the jurisdictions that we looked at did not make any substantive increases to the already inadequate social assistance benefits, so the base benefits that people have access to in 2021. In most cases, there were no increases to basic benefits, and there were only 3 jurisdictions in which basic benefits were actually indexed to inflation in 2021. So in 3 of 13 jurisdictions, only 3 of 13 jurisdictions did social assistance-based benefits increase by the rate of inflation. And there were 3 others that increased benefits simply because of an investment in increases. So of the 13 jurisdictions, only 6 jurisdictions provided increases. And in many instances, inflation was a factor. So those increases were kind of canceled out by the higher rate of inflation in 2021. Another important part of the 2021 story, though, is the loss of COVID-related benefits that were available to families to households in 2020. And, there was a report released this morning by First Call here in BC about child poverty, showing that child poverty in BC decreased from 18% in 2019 to 13% in 2020. And the authors of that report directly attribute the additional COVID-related supports that were available to families and households in 2020. But most of those benefits were not available in 2021. And for the households that we look at, the households on social assistance, we saw a really big difference in terms of declines in total welfare incomes in 2021 in the vast majority of cases. So people receiving social assistance in 2021 were actually worse off than they were in 2020 as a result of the loss of those benefits. You know, some jurisdictions, I should say, some jurisdictions are really trying to make headway on social assistance incomes by increasing their benefit amounts. And we can look at in 2021 PEI in Nova Scotia, but also BC and the jurisdictions that have inflationary indexing, so New Brunswick, Quebec, and Yukon. We're seeing that this in 2022 as well, and I'm just starting to gather, I've just been gathering the data for the 2022 report. There are a number of provinces and territories who are recognizing the hardship of the increase, the much higher inflation in 2022. But rather than increasing base benefits, they're mostly choosing to provide one-off, one-time, relatively small payments instead. And we know, looking back at the 2021 experience and the 2020 experience, these one-time payments are really helpful, but they're really not sufficient to address the already low, very low benefit rates that social assistance programs provide. So we're going to see, we could probably see increases again in 2022, but then what's going to happen in 2023 if those benefits aren't continued?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at 2020, sometimes there'll be an asterisk because, of the circumstances around that. But
exactly.
Just what you mentioned, what can we learn from that? When you do invest, you see those rates drop down. It's simply just a dollar amount. It's income, right, going forward. And all those things you mentioned, I mean, it's deeply disturbing. As Canadians, we should be disturbed by that. When we want people to realize the human right to housing, in theory, that's great. But, simply put, if the dollars aren't there, it's very, very tough to do. Now, let's talk about, you've been doing this work a long time. Every year you do it. Let's talk about some of the trends that you're seeing and maybe some of the things that surprised you in the 2021 report.
Who do you want to go first?
Go ahead and jump in.
Okay, I'll go. So first, I was struck in 2021, and I'm always struck by just how low welfare incomes are. We've been talking about the exploding cost of housing for years. Here where I live, it's almost a daily point of conversation, how hard it is to find decent, affordable housing. And, I think about how much it costs to rent a place and how little incomes are for people receiving social assistance, especially for, as Mohy said, for single people. And I think about how all of those numbers in our reports represent the reality of actual real people across this country who are struggling to make it from day to day. And, it's disturbing that our analysis shows that things really haven't changed very much for the majority of people over the past 20 years. For most of the households that we look at, they're still living at about the same depth of poverty as they did 2 decades ago. And so that's, maybe not surprising, but certainly shocking. And I guess, secondly, I'm struck by just how little the federal government provides to unattached single households in all jurisdictions. And as we've said already, who we're talking about is single people who have no spouse or common law partner and have no children. And benefits. So when we look at the total incomes of those folks, benefits that they get from their province or territory that they live in in 2021, made up between 92 and 99% of welfare incomes. So we're talking about, social assistance-based benefits and any provincial or territorial tax credits that they might receive. So federal benefits made up only between 1% and 8% of their incomes. And we know that those social assistance benefits and tax credits are very low. So, we can see that there are really no meaningful federal benefits that are provided to people of working age who don't have children. They get the GST credit from the federal government, and that's really about it. Now, the federal government, of course, does really contribute fairly significantly to low-income households who do have children, and that's through the Canada Child Benefit. But their contribution to low-income people who don't have children is really pretty minuscule. And, it's shocking because, and surprising, because for a government that has a poverty reduction strategy and has poverty reduction targets that they want to meet, it's shocking that there isn't a larger contribution to the incomes of people on social assistance in Canada by the federal government. We know that people receiving social assistance make up about 35 to 40% of people living in poverty in Canada. So if we want to make significant headway on reducing poverty in Canada, we need to address the incomes of those folks who are on social assistance. We know that people who are on social assistance make up about 51% of people receiving support from food banks. And as I say, if the federal government wants to make a meaningful headway on poverty in Canada, they really need to step up for low-income working age adults who don't have children. So those are my surprises from the 2021 report.
Very cool. Thanks, Jennfer. Mohy, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Jennfer said, but I'd also mention what you said before about one-time measures, because in the 2021 edition of the report, we sort of saw in a way the consequences of what happens after, because in 2020 we had the one-time measures, and the situation of people improved slightly, their adequacy improved. But then in 2021, when you take it away, you see the drop. And because the need is so great, people are that much worse off. And, I was quite, taken by how significant the impact is on some people and on some households. So, it would be ideal and preferable going forward if, instead of one-time measures, to recognize the needs of people and to commit to longer-term income security measures that are sustained, so that people can expect that money, instead of getting it ad hoc depending on what the government thinks at a certain time.
Thank you for that, and thank you both. Such interesting stuff to unpack. I think we're hearing all this information. There are some solutions. I think, Jennfer, you talked about the federal government stepping up. I mean, does one of those solutions, when I think of what's happened with childcare, with a national push on that, with every province having an agreement, the provinces matching up on that. When I think of what's happened with healthcare just recently, with a 10-year deal for healthcare, is that something we can look at? A 10-year deal with all the provinces and territories around that universal basic income. What are some of the solutions or answers here? Because something's got to give.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that we can look to the federal government. There is the Canada Social Transfer, so the federal government can certainly help support people living in social assistance by providing some money to the provinces and territories to provide higher income benefits to social assistance recipients. I should say that there are a number of other measures that have been discussed recently. Of course, there's, the jurisdictions could choose to increase the benefits themselves. I think that would be ideal. And some of them have been choosing to do that, although the pace of the increase is rather minute relative to the need. Even with the increases, it's nowhere near the scale that's needed for people to live an adequate standard of living. In terms of other potential solutions, recently in Parliament, there's been the Bill C-22 on the Canada Disability Benefit. And although we don't know what that will look like, because that'll be determined in the regulation stage, it has the potential to increase the adequacy of income supports for people living with disabilities, which make up a large proportion of people living in deep poverty in Canada. But advocates and people in the sector will have to work with the government and encourage the government to make sure that the CDB addresses the poverty of people with disabilities, and that it's not tied to labor, because very often in Canada, when we talk about income supports, it's in the context of encouraging people to work, but it doesn't recognize that some people can't work, or that they may need more support to be able to work. And more recently, in the fall of 2022, Maytree published a report with CFCC on the enhancement of the Canada Workers Benefit into a Canada Working Age Supplement. So, and for those who don't know, the Canada Workers Benefit is a federal refundable tax credit, and it's the most generous of the three refundable tax credits that are generally available to people, but it's not accessible to people receiving social assistance with no labor market attachment, because you need to earn at least $3,000 a year to receive it. And so in this enhancement, we recommend that the government create a foundational support of about $3,000 that is accessible to people people receiving social assistance, and as well, it would have a $1,000 employment boost for a maximum of $4,000, and we've modeled that, and it would definitely improve the adequacy of for people, for unattached singles, both considered employable and with disabilities.
Yeah, and I would just add that if people are looking for advocacy points, for example, around how to improve incomes for people on social assistance, as Mohy has already said, there's a number of pieces. They should be pushing for higher social assistance benefits in their jurisdiction, higher tax delivered benefits and credits, so those should be increased in jurisdictions where they exist and created in jurisdictions where they don't exist. I mean, there are some provinces and territories that don't have child benefits, for example, or don't have a low income tax credit. So those are some pieces that folks could be looking to and advocating around. They should also be asking for benefits to be indexed annually. As I said earlier, there's only 3 jurisdictions in 2021 that had indexing. There have been more since then. But most benefits for low-income people are not indexed to the rate of inflation, and we're going to really see the impact of that in 2022 once that report comes out, because inflation was, up around, well, I mean, depending on what we're looking at very high rates of inflation that significantly impact the purchasing power of the incomes for people on social assistance that are, as we've already said, are already extremely low. So indexing really needs to be part of the package. And I know that there are a number of really interesting proposals that some organizations are talking about how to improve the Canada Child Benefit for particular populations, particularly. So, the federal government could be looking at those as well. And as Mohy's already said, my big, the bell that I like to ring a lot is the Canada Social Transfer. As you said, Michael, there are these agreements happening between the provinces and the feds on other issues. And we really need to, we already have a mechanism by which the federal government can contribute to social assistance incomes, to increasing those incomes. And that's the Canada Social Transfer. So, putting more money into the Canada Social Transfer and reaching agreements with the provinces and territories about how they spend that money. In other words, spend it to increase the incomes of folks on social assistance would be really, really helpful. But we can't lose sight of the fact that governments also need to invest in the kinds of basic supports and services that would really reduce the cost of living. So, deeply affordable housing. We really need to, we have dropped the ball in Canada, as you and your listeners well know, for many decades on affordable housing, and governments need to get back into the business of providing deeply affordable housing. We're seeing the impacts of that every day in the services that your organization provides, and on the streets and the spare bedrooms and couches all across Canada. Improving access to affordable, healthy food, ensuring a wide range of needed healthcare expenses are covered. So there's a lot of, as Mohy says, there's a lot of work to be done. But there are many, many places where governments can make investments that would really make a big difference.
Absolutely, there are. I mean, we've had Neil Hetherington, who runs the Daily Bread Food Bank in Toronto, on quite a few times. They do their Who's Hungry report, and in their 2022 report, they were talking about, and I'm sure you'll see this as you gather info, or you might already be seeing this. It's just a different type of person, a different type of user now that's going to. He's seeing more middle income earners going to the food bank because of those the cost of living you mentioned there not being indexed. Inflation hits our most vulnerable even worse, and so you're seeing more and more people who, because they're spending so much more on housing, there's nothing left over. I think they say the average food bank user has $8 left over. This is in Ontario. Once they're done paying for housing costs, and Black and Indigenous individuals using the food bank have $6 left over after paying for everything, right? I mean, and many, I think there's 12% that absolutely have nothing. And Neil will always say, he's like, the answer is not more food banks, folks. Like, let's not step up the food bank yet. But it is around income and truly affordable housing. And as you said, Jennfer, I mean, this began in the 80s, really ramped up in the 90s due to bad policy choices. So we've got to make some good choices now. We have to rapidly ramp up our social housing and access to it. But honestly, I think that takes time. I think there's some measures that they could do immediately with these transfers that would make a huge difference. We've seen in BC, there was the Group for Social Change that did the cash transfer project. It was $7,500 to a bunch of people. So it's basically almost doubling what a single person would earn on social assistance in most places, a little less. But just in doing that, never heard from it again. We're able to get housed. We're using alcohol and drugs less, right? I mean, and so they had more money there. Some were saving money. It was really incredible, and that's a small sample, and they're ramping that up as well. Out in Newfoundland, I know Sheldon Paul and his team are doing some work with youth where they're working with social assistance teams to bend some of those rules a little bit about working, that they can keep more of their income. Part of what Sheldon was telling us when he came on the podcast was that some people are really scared to come off of the benefits because it's hard to get back on, especially around disability. So if I do this, I work, if something goes sideways, I'm going to lose that, and then I'm going to be in real trouble again. So they're making it easy and working through that. In Ontario right now, they're talking about a total revamp of social assistance, but they're not really talking about dollars here. They're talking about how it's delivered and the ways there. We know that in Ontario, there's a 5% increase this year. I think just for ODSP, not for Ontario Works Social Assistance. And what that came to about $42 a month. I mean, this is not life-changing money that needs to happen. I think if we look at it, and correct me if I'm wrong, in most cases, we're looking at a doubling of these incomes or benefits to really make a sizable impact, are we not?
If not more than that.
Yeah, exactly. Go ahead, Mohy.
No, I mean, as I mentioned, especially for unattached singles, the amounts are, less than, in some places, less than half of the market basket measure, which is the measure of poverty. So if you're at below half and you double, you're still below the poverty line. And I think it's unfortunate that so many people have to go through hoops to receive their income support, and there has to be reform there as well in how we treat people and and destigmatizing income support, because I mean, this is the state of the economy right now, where people are finding themselves in these situations, and we shouldn't judge them, and the government should provide the support with more dignity and more respect.
Definitely. And I just wanted to add another quick piece, which is, I was really struck the other day. I was looking at a report that talked about the loss of fiscal space by governments over the last 20, 30 years. I think that they said that corporate tax cuts over the last 20 years have resulted in a loss of $1.1 trillion in public monies. that could otherwise be going to spending on the kinds of supports and services that people need. There seems to be kind of a bit of mass amnesia about about remembering how we got to this place, with the variety of really bad situations that we find ourselves in terms of government investment in social housing, in terms of investment in healthcare, in terms of investment in the social supports that people need, in terms of investment in income supports. And we need to recognize that a lot of the crunch that we're seeing right now is, as you say, Michael, not just from bad policy choices, but also giving away our fiscal capacity. If we don't have the money to spend, we don't have the money to spend. So we need to be looking at, and have we need to be questioning whether or not those tax giveaways have actually resulted in the kind of society that, and the kind of economy, really, that that was promised when those tax cuts were made. We really need to look at the revenue side of the equation and whether or not governments have enough money to spend, and what sources they're getting that money from. Because, as we've been saying, if we're going to be doubling or more social assistance incomes, we need to find that money from somewhere.
Yeah, that's well said, and that's something that everyone thinks about. There's got to be mechanisms around it, and I think quite often when people salivate at tax cuts, they don't realize the implications of that tax cut, that extra tiny little bit of money that might go to your bottom line, what it does to society as a whole, and it's really hard to walk that back. I mean, in the city I live in, Toronto, and for years, even Mississauga right now, Mayor McCallion passed away, and her big thing was, low taxes forever, no increases in taxes. And if you asked her later in her later years, she'd say that was a bit of a mistake. It made people happy, it got her reelected, but what did it do to the infrastructure, the dollars coming in to pay for all that, right? So I think we do need it's a great point around or the income sources for federal governments and provincial governments, all governments. Now, are there examples of countries that are doing this well that we can look to say, that's what we should aspire to? Like, this is working well. And am I safe to assume too, for naysayers might say, well, it's going to cost too much. On the flip end of that, if you're investing in the social welfare of people, are you saving a ton of money too on hospitalization and all the different pieces that fall out when you don't invest in people? So a bit of a layered question, but open to your thoughts.
That's so the comparative analysis is not something that we do in this report or others. So I can't really point to, and maybe Mohy's got some good examples, point to other jurisdictions in the world that are doing this better. But I can say that, from the kind of discussions that I've had with folks who do that kind of work, a real key is, as we've just been saying, is ensuring that governments have enough revenue to be able to spend on social priorities. So, in jurisdictions where there are higher taxation rates, they do a better job at, spending on the kinds of income supports and other kinds of supports that people living there need. Mohy, do you have any other info about that part of the question?
In terms of other jurisdictions, I don't think there's an example that stands out in particular that I would say, that's the model that we need to that Canada needs to follow. And I should also note that, social safety nets and tax systems are different in other countries. And even if there's a system that looks a bit different, sometimes adapting to that type of system would require a very large, cost of transfer. So, I mean, in Canada, in a way, we do have a structure that we can build on. It's more that we haven't chosen to build on it for a very long time, and we've sort of neglected it for a long time. But yeah, not that I've seen I mean, maybe others have done this work, but not for me personally.
And in terms of the other part of your question about investing in social supports results in lower costs in other areas, that's definitely true. I don't have the numbers immediately to hand, but there was a report I remember by, was it Daily Bread? I can't remember. Back in the, this has got to be 15 years ago, maybe, that said that poverty cost, I think that they still may do this report. At that time, poverty was costing $6 billion a year or something like that. In other associated costs. So, if and we can see the impacts of not spending, as I was saying earlier, like all around us all the time. I mean, especially in terms of the crisis in homelessness and the crisis in mental health supports. If people are given the kinds of supports that all of us need, if there's a basic level of dignity that all of us can rely on through social provision, benefit programs, housing programs, mental health supports, all of us will be better off. We wouldn't be seeing the kinds of difficulty that people are having on our streets and all across this country. We wouldn't be seeing the same kind of health impacts. So yeah, I mean, as I say, I don't have the numbers to support that right at my fingertips, but it's not, you don't have to look far to see the impacts of the lack of social spending in Canada.
On that question in particular, in different areas of social policy, we talk about social determinants, especially social determinants of health, social determinants of justice, and these are a number of determinants that help predict or help us understand the particular situation of a person. And very often one of the determinants and one of the major determinants is income, and it is the adequacy of your income. So of course, if you can't afford food, you can't afford medicine, your health will decline, and that becomes a cost on the healthcare system, which you could have prevented ahead. And it's not just preventing the cost to the healthcare system, it's also preventing the unneeded suffering that a person has experienced to end up in the healthcare system. And it's the same thing with the criminal justice system, where people don't find ways to sustain themselves or are criminalized for being poor, and they find themselves in the criminal justice system. So definitely, I feel like in this country we need to have a bit more data about how exactly and the actual numbers in terms of the costs of how much poverty has cost Canada, further up the chain, that could have been prevented and could have, saved money to improve the quality of life of Canadians and people in Canada in general.
Absolutely. To what you're both saying when you mentioned the word prevention there, for the past few years, I mean, Dr. Stephen Gates from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, Melanie Redmond from Away Home Canada, and many others have been pushing prevention, saying that we keep reacting to all these problems, and it's great to patch it up and stop the flow. But if you don't actually go upstream and look at the systems that are broken, Mohy, you talked about some of them: criminal justice system, child welfare system, different systems that are broken that are actually launching people right into poverty, into homelessness. You're never really going to end it, right? So we've got to sink some dollars investment into prevention. And Jennfer, I think, and it's an old number now, a few years back, they're saying homelessness costs Canadians $7 billion a year. I would venture it's around 10 by this point, because that's an old number. But yeah, I mean, there's already a huge cost there. If we could take half of that and prevent homelessness and poverty, or reduce poverty greatly, not only would you save money, you save lives, which is important work. Listen, we could talk about this report for a long, long time, but I would encourage people. It's a super informative report, and one that will come out each year, and we'd love to have you back every year to talk about our learnings. And maybe one year we'll say, wow, we're really, really surprised things are turning around. I'm hopeful. But if people want to check out this report, where can they go?
Yeah, and I agree with you. Every year, when we do the modeling, I always hope that things look better, but I'm often disappointed, unfortunately. Uh, so in terms of the report, you can find it on Maytree's website. It's available on its entirety free of charge. Uh, there's a profile for every jurisdiction, every province and territory, and as well as an all Canada section that's a comparison across the entire country. And we also produce a policy brief called Interpreting the Data, Key Takeaways from Welfare in Canada, which provides more analysis and recommendations on the Welfare in Canada report. And I encourage you to check out Maytree's work in general. We do a lot of work on income security, on housing. We have a great podcast and event series called 5 Good Ideas, as well as Maytree Policy School, which is a great resource. And if you're interested in the report I mentioned earlier about the Canada Working Age Supplement, you can find how to reduce the depth of single adult poverty in Canada, proposal for Canada Working Age Supplement on our website as well.
Yeah, I thank you for that. I encourage people go to Maytree's website. I mean, the depth of information for organizations like mine. You make it so simple to not only access the data, but to interpret it and use it and make it useful. And that's what we're always asked for. I mean, the first question when I got into the homelessness sector in 2010 was, well, how many? How many people are we talking about here? Show me the numbers. Show me, well, how are we going to make a difference? And we had access to none of that, and that's changed thankfully over time. And now we know, what is the problem? What is the depth of the pro? And you're showing that. You're showing this through your work. This is truly, truly important stuff. You're highlighting welfare in Canada. People have to understand and wrap their heads around it. And with that data, hopefully that becomes power to make real change happen. Let's hope. And let's hope next year we're going to be having a different conversation. We can't think of that. Maybe not. It's been a tough year with inflation for our most vulnerable. But let's keep talking about it and sharing that information. More awareness and education. And that's what this podcast is all about, that we deliver. The faster things can change. Mohy, Jennfer, thank you for the work you do. Truly grateful. And thank you for taking the time with your busy schedules to join us on the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Michael.
Thank you for having us
here. Yeah.
Well, I you're going to hear me talk about this almost too much on this podcast, but listen, income matters. The gap is huge and it's growing. In Ontario, we're talking about people, social assistance rates that are lower than they were in 1995. I can't even remember that far back. Imagine your income hadn't changed since 1995. Crazy, but it hasn't. And you heard Mohy say, even if we doubled it, they'd still be below the poverty line. Think of that. Doubling it, still below the poverty line. Unacceptable. We shouldn't accept this as Canadians. If you want to do something about it, right now I'd encourage you to go to caeh.ca, look at their housing benefit. There's an easy way to send a letter off to your MP and push them to make this an issue across Canada. You heard Jennfer talk about that, do the service transfer. Love that. That's what needs to happen here. We've seen it happen. It can happen. It's happened with health. It's happened with childcare. Let's make it happen with poverty and housing. Let's push this forward. It's up to you and I, listener. Thanks so much for joining. Please share this podcast widely, and we'll see you next time on the way home.